and of course, someone like me, I've done a lot of retreats. So yeah, okay, I may be accepted because of that, but I don't have to declare this sort of exclusive surrender to a teaching or to path. So most Dhamma organizations are way more porous than Goenkajis. That sense of in and out does not exist. In fact, they're very generous in the sense that if you're sitting retreats in any tradition, you're doing the work. You're on the path. It's a very much more of an you might say a fellowship, and a broader ecumenical kind of fellowship around just being on the path. Because of their desire to belong, to sit retreats, to sit longer retreats, they end up, putting down false information on their applications so that they can get in. It was so disorienting to think about leaving that when I actually did leave, I didn't know whether I could even, I actually live about a 7-minute walk from there. I didn't know whether I could literally walk over there and say goodbye, to the pagoda that I had helped build, or to the grounds and the trails that I had walked, or to the garden space that I had grown there. There were so many pieces to that were just profoundly sad to leave, to think about leaving. I think, and that's because I was willing to ask questions and to be critical and allow myself to do kind of what at one point seemed to be unthinkable, which is to question everything that you and I have both been questioning in our respective paths here.
Whether one is listening to this in Myanmar or from outside the country, we know it is a very difficult time for those of us who hold the Golden Land and its people in our hearts. In trying times like these, we can all use a bit more care and compassion in our lives. So on behalf of the team here at Insight Myanmar, I would like to say, in the traditional way metta is offered, may you be free from physical discomfort. May you be free from mental discomfort. May you not meet dangers or enemies. May you live a peaceful and happy life. And may all beings be free and come out of suffering. And with that, let's move on to the show. And I'm here for the 6th time that Jonathan Crowley and I are speaking. This might not necessarily be the last time, but is the culminating piece of where this has been building to. And I think it'll be very interesting once this is released and we get engagement, positive and negative, critical, definitely. It would be appreciated from listeners, and seeing where the engagement goes and how the conversation happens, and where future talks and conversations go with Jonathan, as well as others who might come on to speak about the topic. But in this particular story we're telling, this is the kind of final culminating piece that caps off this string of conversations that we've been having. So we will definitely be pursuing this 6th conversation. There could be more after this, but let's get into the one that follows now and see where this goes. And I would also add, before we get into this conversation, to encourage listeners again, if you haven't heard the talks before this, you might want to go and take a listen to that and get up to date. Otherwise, let's get into this sixth talk here. So, Jonathan, thanks so much for coming back to share the update of where you left off from before.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joe. It's great to be back and great to be having this conversation with you.
Right. So before we started recording, you had indicated both where we left off last time and the cliffhanger and where you wanted to take it, as well as what was on your mind in this time of what kind of where you wanted to start the story and what elements you wanted to lay. So rather than ask a question, I'm just going to turn this over to you and have you start to pick up and share from where you like to.
Yeah, well, I remember last time we left off on this somewhat of a bit of a cliffhanger around that, all these issues, all these sort of organizational issues that we have been talking about and cultural sort of mindset within the Goenka tradition. In the end, that really wasn't actually why Carolyn and I left. However, those issues were indicative of many of the reasons why we left, and I want to sort of continue along those lines because just in terms of just the time period, I think we were coming up around around 2020, around the beginning of the pandemic, and also around all of the racial unrest that was happening across the country. And one of the things that Carol and I began to see right away was just how other organizations that we are either members of or associated with were responding, and in many kind of courageous ways. And yet we didn't see that happening within the organization, the Goenka tradition. And that felt like a big kind of silent gulf for us that we, and this was kind of on the heels of, feeling pretty well, initially sort of encouraged by the presentation that we had helped do with the acharyas the previous fall, where we had brought a lot of issues around caring for old students to them. And there was mixed response to that, but we were still thinking, okay, it was received. It moved the needle among with some acharyas. Obviously, other acharyas were labeling us as just being negative. But we felt like, okay, there's some momentum here. And then when all the racial unrest happened, and we were, looking at that, looking at our own, just the pain around for me, I'll speak about myself just as a white male around that. And, being inspired. I mean, I remember reading a letter from my high school headmaster about how he was going to address all of the structural racism that was being brought up by both former and current Black students at the high school. And I was just so taken with that courage for him to, very openly, transparently say, we're gonna address this, and we're gonna create teams to do this. So, Carol and I both felt like we needed to write a letter to the North American acharyas, and we weren't exactly sure how to do that. We were nervous about it, but if it's okay, Joe, I'd actually like to read the letter that we wrote. So it may seem a little confusing, but we began the letter actually with a letter that we wish they had written to us. So we composed this letter a letter that we had wished they had wrote, not just to us, but to the entire to the entire student base. So it begins, "Dear old student, Goenkaji explains in the 10-day course that whenever we find ourselves in the middle of a conflict, we should do everything in our power to stop an aggressor with the base of compassion. Goenkaji says we should feel compassion for the aggressor because they are perpetuating their suffering, harming themselves and others. As acharyas of Vipassana meditation in the tradition of Saiji Ubakin as taught by S.N. Goenka, we recognize that the recent protests over the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless other Black people are an expression of pain with the system of racism and racial violence that is part and parcel of the fabric of the United States of America since its founding. Racism is an insidiously conditioned sankhara, and the Buddha spoke on numerous occasions about the racism of his time, the caste system, where Brahmins considered themselves the superior caste. Quote, "Not by birth does one become an outcast. Not by birth does one become a Brahmin. By one's actions, one becomes an outcast. And by one's actions, one becomes a Brahmin." Unquote. That's from the Sutta Nipata. We want our old students to know that we are committed to taking transparent action to address how attitudes of white supremacy and privilege have impacted our own Dhamma organizational culture, and to transform Dhamma.org into an expressly anti-racist community. While silence is critical to meditation, we understand that silence in the face of oppression results in violence. As a first step, the acharyas of North America are creating an anti-racism task force, which will include white caucuses as well as ATs of color, to begin the work of creating dialogues and soliciting feedback to address any organizational culture, behaviors, and policies that support racism. The anti-racism task force will be composed of old students, center managers, committee members, trustees, ATs, senior ATs, and acharya representatives from each center. We are committed to appointing acharyas of color who will support our Dhamma communities of color with courses for people of color. We acknowledge that these steps are already too little and too late, so we want to make certain we exceed these efforts on an ongoing basis. We want to take this moment to expressly apologize for any harm out of ignorance that our tradition has inflicted or perpetuated on its Black old students and old students of color, present and past. We have been complicit, negligent, and at times actively enabling in our failures to address the racism that exists within our own tradition. We should not have needed an external social movement such as this one to turn a mirror on ourselves. We should not have needed the persistence and patience of our old students of color to call us to higher ground. We should not have needed this national uprising to inspire us to active anti-racism. Now that we have been called to this reckoning, however, we are ready and grateful to respond to the call. We stand against and meditate to come out of the ignorance that conditions racism. We're profoundly grateful for all the old students of color in our community who have conveyed painful stories of their experiences navigating a white world at our centers. Many have courageously insisted that Goenkaji's tradition live up to its mission commitment to liberate all beings inclusively. We are determined to prove worthy of their hopes for our tradition. We are at a beginning in this work, and we appreciate your patience as we urgently address these issues. We are grateful for the energy and commitment of the many old students who have already stepped forward to assume an energizing role in this work. Most of all, we are grateful for this opportunity to do better. We can and we must do so. Signed, North American Acharyas. Dear North American Acharyas, the above letter is an imagined letter, one that we hope to have received from the North American Acharyas this spring. In the last month, we have seen an outpouring of statements and letters like these from organizations around the world. These statements come from leaders that have been willing to reflect and examine their own racial conditioning enough to challenge racism where it arises. These statements communicate compassion, humanity, and a willingness to name hatred and ignorance when it shows up in our society. In 2002, in the wake of 9/11, Goenkaji spoke out compassionately against terrorism at nearly every one of his 40 public Dhamma speeches across the country. When you, as leaders of our tradition, choose not to speak out for fear of politics, or for causing offense, or because of holding ultimate truths as a dismissal of conventional reality, our tradition's silence becomes complicit with the system. Below is a quote from a leading African American Buddhist teacher. Quote, "We are at a critical moment in the history of the nation, as well as within the Buddhist teaching and tradition in America. This is the, quote, back of the bus, unquote, moment of our time. 50 years after civil rights laws were laid down, it is clear that these laws were enshrined within a structure that continues to profit from anti-Black racism. The necessary bias that the system requires in order to perpetuate itself has permeated our sanghas. And in this very moment, Buddhists are called upon to put aside business as usual. If you have ever wondered how you would have shown up in the face of the challenge put before white America when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, upending the accepted social order, now is when you will find out. Will we actually embody our practice and teachings or not? It is a clarifying moment about who we are as individuals and who we have been thus far as a collective of people, laying claim to the teachings of the Buddha, waving the flag of wisdom and compassion all the while. The work of Dharma communities is the same work of the America that wants to live up to its promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is to kick the habit of racism, cultural dominance, and upholding oppressive systems. More poignantly, our challenge, our responsibility, our deep resounding call is to be at the forefront of this overdue evolutionary thrust forward. Why? Because we chose to position ourselves as the standard bearers of an ethical high ground, and we have the tools and the teachings to do so, unquote. This is a quote by Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. We respectfully ask you to take timely, urgent action and lead with the strength and compassion of Dhamma. This is not a time for spiritual aloofness. Our country and the world is in deep pain because of racism, and our tradition must be an example of courage and loving kindness. With metta, Jonathan and Carolyn Crowley." So this was the letter that we wrote to the acharyas. And, the first part of it was purposely a letter that looked like it was a letter from them to every old student in the database. And so we wanted to that was our way of sort of just, challenging, sort of, disrupting the status quo, to write a letter that they might wonder, wait, did this letter go out to all the old students? And then to, once that became clear that it was just an imaginary letter, to then make our point about what we were asking for. And so we sent that letter to 52 North American acharyas, every acharya in North America that we were aware of, many of whom were very, very, very close and dear friends, folks we felt like family with, folks we had served and sat long courses with here and in India, in Myanmar, and many whom we considered really like family. They were our Sangha. And I felt very fortunate to have the relationships where I felt like I could write a letter like this. But I was also aware that it was a challenging letter, that it would be confronting for some, and that it would, in many ways, peg us as simply just negative or off the reservation. And so we sent that in July of 2020 and waited with bated breath to see what the response would be. And to our really kind of, in many ways, just to our deep sadness, we only received 2 responses. And that was even more painful than the anxiety of waiting for the responses. And one of the responses was from a recently appointed acharya who was, in fact, actually very open to having the conversation. and who is married to, I believe, a biracial woman, and who, wanted to, inquire further. And we began a correspondence with that acharya, and that was helpful. They hadn't really explored these issues, but there was an openness. The other response was from, another acharya who basically chastised us for um, writing to all of the acharyas without informing him.
Mm.
And we're very close with this acharya. We again, he and his wife are like family to us, and it was hard to get that sort of slap on the wrist for doing that. But those were the two responses we received. And then, yeah, so, there's a lot in that letter, but it was sort of a culminating piece. And it also began looking, I think all those pieces, Joe, that we've been talking about around, sort of the spiritual bypass, the kind of emotional, the compartmentalization that happens, all these kind of cultural and mindset pieces that we've talked about, for me, they ended up manifesting in terms of looking at this kind of gaping silence in regard to the structural racism that I was seeing in the organization. Again, around allowing folks of color to have a pathway into the organization beyond just sitting courses or serving courses, and beyond the exceptions of one or two being appointed, from a random at a random center here and there, and instead looking at how does the organization create pathways of inclusion and equity so that average folks of color who normally wouldn't be able to economically and socially and racially be able to advance in the organization to get to be in positions of leadership, be able to do so. And there were a lot of systemic things that Carolyn and I identified that would make a big difference. I'm very lucky. Carolyn works in HR, so we could really look at it through that lens, and that was very helpful because she was in the midst of doing that for the organizations we work for. And it's just basic stuff. But the resistance we got was, basically that addressing racism or any social injustice and the Dhamma don't go together. And that was kind of the refrain that we got over and over and over again. And we began to then, we shifted gears. We began to then address this with our local acharya. And there was also some correspondence that at some point I'd love to read pieces of that too, because it goes,
Sure.
yeah. So anyway, I don't know if that just takes some of our conversation a little forward. This was sort of reaching a very culminating point in the summer of 2020 and kind of moving us closer to for the first time I began to think, can I really represent this organization? Can I continue here? And that was a disturbing and painful thought to have after 35 years of putting so much into the organization, getting so much out of it. This is what we've talked about, just the idealism, the transformation, the sense of purpose that both you and I have, talked about. It was just because I was becoming deeply disillusioned, and it was a very, very painful process to experience that disillusionment, to see our efforts that were being stonewalled, our feedback rejected, our writing on the topic censored. To have this formative, developmental, transformative purpose in my life suddenly to be revealed as having so many holes in it. It was very profoundly sad for me. Yeah.
And what was it like for you to read that letter just now? How did it feel to go back and revisit the memories of what it was like to put that together?
It was intense. Just the issues around just looking at my own, lack of humanity has been so profound for me in, looking at my racism, right? And looking at my conditioning around racism, and looking at my,
Mhm.
and I was kind of getting to a point where I felt like, okay, not just that I had kind of gone through the extreme, and it is extremely discomfortable, uncomfortable to go through looking at life through that lens of, how has my, conditioning shaped me, and how I am a racist. And again, I say that not, uh, I say that because I acknowledge how I have been conditioned in this system. And, I was just getting to a point of just feeling the fluency, being able to be fluent in that, and being comfortable to own this, and own that I'm on a path here to shift gears around that, and wanting to do that, and having aspirations to do that. But so, yeah, to then turn toward the organization that I care the most about, where I could see the impact of structural racism, and to have that response. Again, I was coming at it projecting all my ideals, and looking up to all these acharyas as um, folks who had brought me up in the Dhamma, and it was, yeah, it was, writing the letter was painful to do. It was taking a huge risk, and then to confirm that it was a risk,
Mm.
was, yeah, it was just, it was sad. It was sad, and it pains me now. I think there have been steps taken since 2020. I want to acknowledge that. And yet it's not enough. Looking from the outside, I don't see it as enough. But just to have gotten that level, to just, yeah, to receive that level of resistance and rejection around that was super painful. Was super painful. Yeah. And yeah, but reading this letter reminds me of that moment was like for Carolyn and I to do that.
One of the things I think of when I hear that letter that really strikes me, especially in the context of when that letter is written, is just this question around transparency. And I think I think in looking at other types of organizations or institutions where you have people at different levels, whether they're students or participants or employees, and some kind of management, some kind of ownership, whatever the relationship is between that at different companies, institution, there's some level of knowledge about these conversations taking place, or they might start in one place and go to another place, or there might be a confrontation between one level and another. And what really strikes me about this letter is the fact that for many meditators in the Goenka tradition who are listening today, I would think that for most of them, they never knew this letter had ever existed before. They had no idea that there was a discussion behind the scenes to look at what to do or how to do it, or what kind of conversation to engage in. And so this really points back to this organization just having an extraordinarily lack of transparency, where if for those meditators that at some stage of involvement with the organization that are concerned about this, people of color or people of any background who are concerned about the institutional racism and white privilege and the BLM protests and the police killings at this time, everything that was happening, what was the avenue for them to know what was going on and to engage and to make their voice heard, or express their level of comfort or discomfort? I don't know where that really was. And this speaks to.
There was none, Joe,
Mhm.
because again, in our North American database, we're not tracking old students of color. They're the demographics. We're not tracking folks who are Hispanic or Black.
Mm.
And so without that, there's no way to communicate or to, for example, to do a survey. And that was one of the things that Carolyn and I proposed. We said, well, listen, let's do a survey and put this out to the entire database and invite old students of color to talk about how their experiences of inclusivity in the organization, their experiences of coming to essentially a white cultured retreat environment, and to get feedback, just to be open to feedback, right? And yet that was shut down. That was just completely shut down. And that was just that's like HR, that's like DEI 101 for
Mm.
any
Mhm.
organization, let alone a nonprofit, and charitable organization. That's just basic. That's just basic humanitarian, and so I began to lose hope when just that piece alone was not being considered. Um, and it was just profoundly disturbing because it just cuts off a level of communication. And so then that means that these kinds of communications are backroom conversations, right? There's not a willingness to one, receive feedback, and another to have a conversation, even through a survey format, right? That's sad. That's sad for any organization. And it's particularly sad for a Dhamma organization that holds so many ideals around, you know, personal liberation. If we can't, if we can't put these kinds of um, pieces into our organization, how do we expect to actually, with that dissonance, how do we expect to actually experience personal liberation? I don't see it.
Right, and with that lack of transparency, it's also just bringing out the nature of a very rigid hierarchy, of very rigid authority, and also the secrecy that's inherent in that, because this is basically a secret communique. And then you're later reprimanded for having even taking this step to have wanted to reach out to the people on this list. Even that was something that you were reprimanded for, not supposed to do. But it leaves open the question of, if one cared about this, if one was at any level of the organization, from any kind of practice or serving or any kind of role, what, if any, was the possibility of being able to know what was going on, or to engage in what was going on, or to express an opinion? It was really, this just really lays bare these features of a lack of transparency, an emphasis on secrecy, and a priority on hierarchy and authority in deciding. And in this case, the hierarchy and authority, at least in North America, is mainly older white men, as far as I understand. That this really rests with their perspective and their understanding, or lack thereof, in terms of what they do and why they do it. And it doesn't sound like there's really any avenue for discussion or understanding or engagement along those lines.
Yeah, there certainly, it was a very, let's just say, constrained conversation, and I would like to include some of my correspondence with other acharyas who did respond, but
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, what you're speaking to here is the consequence, right, of these other mindsets and kind of,
Exactly.
right.
Exactly.
It's a consequence of it, which at a organizational, and you could just say global level, was impacting our world so dramatically. I mean, to go back to, I
Hmm.
mean, some of the news cycle has moved on. Not really. I mean, let's look at the recent murder of Tyree. I mean, this is ongoing, right? But I think with the if you can recall, the pandemic had just begun when when the George Floyd murder had, and how that was galvanizing the country at that moment. It was a moment, right? And we were all feeling it, maybe because of, more intensely because of the pandemic. Our business as usual had already been stopped. So we had the time to actually reflect on our society and as on ourselves as white people, right? It was an incredible, poignant opportunity moment. And so, yeah. But I saw it as a real consequence of stuff that you and I have already been talking about, that was already endemic within the organization. And so, we did get this chastising letter from an acharya. And I just want to also say that, this is not, on some level, I'm having this conversation with you, I think, because I do still feel, believe in the capacity for organizations maybe it's a question for us to talk about, can an organization like this that has these kinds of organizational culture and mindset, baked in, can they change? Can they get off the perch? And what has to be addressed? But I was seeing how that there was also human conversations that were trying to be had, and my challenge at this moment was, I had done a little bit of work around anti-racism, was not to call out, right? But to call in, right? To call in, the white leadership of the organization and say, hey, listen, this is something that is relevant to the Dhamma and to the relevancy of our organization as a Dhamma organization, and to the relevancy of a huge swath of our, national old student population, of color. And so, I knew, and I'll say I made mistakes. I made mistakes because I was also at times calling out rather than calling in, and I was strident, and I was making those mistakes, right, of not seeing, in some ways, the humanity of the folks I was trying to address in trying to get a response that I had hoped for, right? And yet at the same time, I was also, directly experiencing their resistance. So the chastisement letter was that resistance. And I wrote back to the acharyas. I said, thanks for your message. Dear Acharya, thanks for your message. We've been struggling with how to craft a response back to you that is both respectful and honest. Our decision to email the acharyas as a group was deliberate and was not an easy decision. We know your position on this issue. We have heard many times about the need for our tradition to remain beyond politics so as not to alienate anyone. We respectfully disagree with this position for a variety of reasons. There's always a way to frame this conversation in a way that is skillful. In the same way that we condemn killing or theft without fear of offending murderers and thieves everywhere. We struggle with how to articulate in a way that can be understood and appreciated that racism is not simply a political or social justice issue. It is a deeply rooted conditioning that we all need to work on uprooting constantly within ourselves and our institutions, using all the tools we have in order to not continue to harm the people of color in our communities. Our tradition operates under the unfortunate assumption that inclusivity can simply be a policy. We can decide to be inclusive, add a tab to the website about it, and think we have done our job. Countless voices from the Black community have articulated precisely why that doesn't work. If you were to ask any person of color working in the space of anti-racism, you would learn that best practices and what they are pleading with white people to do is intentionally reflect and dialogue with other white people on their racial conditioning. You and the two other acharyas in North America, senior acharyas, are in an extraordinary position to signal to all white ATs like myself to take this work upon themselves so that at the very least they can more compassionately serve students of color, and our culture can signal to students of color that our centers are truly safe places and for them to open themselves to a deep operation of the mind. Jonathan and I don't have to go into all this again with you. Suffice it to say that when you look in the faces of other acharyas and you see no Black people, surely that tells you that something is not working. Perhaps the organization would feel differently about the need to do this work if Black people had representation among leadership or if you were receiving input from them. We hope that the leaders of this tradition can recognize the responsibility for leadership that you have in real inclusion and equity, and on the flip side, racial ignorance, imbalance, and harm that as white people you're not able to see. It's probably not necessary to meet and discuss this further, since if we are truthful, we don't actually have a lot of hope that minds can be changed. However, we would feel negligent had we not written the letter. Respectfully and compassionately, we will continue to challenge the organization in this way. We are asking you to do the same so that we can truly welcome all to our centers. So that was the, immediate response to an acharya who I care and love very much, mm-hmm. and who I began a conversation with around this, and who then began to ask me, okay, so, well, he then wrote a letter to me. He's like, where is the racism at VMC, the
Mhm.
Vipassana Meditation Center at Shelburne Falls?
Mhm.
And he said, I do not see it in our staff. Do you? If so, please articulate it. Even speaking with another Acharya and a couple of staff members, they are hard pressed to articulate structural racism at VMC. I do not say it does not exist, but can you point out specifics? Understanding human nature, it is clear that we all have conditioned bias. However, by having a conversation to take the lid off our own racism, everyone is beginning the work of eradicating their own negativities. With our own racism exposed to us via individual exploration, Vipassana will then get us to the deep rooted cause of racism, as well as all other manifestations of hate. We are so fortunate to have Dhamma. So on one level, he was saying, if we can have this conversation, we'll be taking this so-called lid off of this issue.
Mhm.
But in fact, there wasn't an openness to having those conversations.
Mhm.
But to his credit, he was also saying, we were starting to lose hope at this point, because of the response. But he was also saying, listen, I only want to start an open conversation with both of you. And, was, basically saying we're brothers and sisters and should try to hear each other. So there was a human interaction happening here on this, there was on one level an openness and on one level not an openness. Because when we would then push for specifics, those initiatives like, a database that tracked demographics or doing a survey, or even at this point, now we are having Black heritage courses, but at that point, those were not allowed. And this Acharya had spoken out against them 10 years earlier when, just prior to Goenkaji holding the first uh, uh, course of Black heritage in India. And so there were some changes, and yet there was also still kind of this mix of resistance as well. And so we were kind of just dealing with our frustration at the pace of change. In fact, the Acharyas did organize a task force that I think they called it the Exploring Racial Barriers Committee. They didn't include anyone else except for Acharyas, but so that limited the input that they were, necessarily, needed to have. But and it did take them a year to put out a letter, at least to me, asking for input. But so there was this mix of response, and I don't think that work is done yet, and I would continue to challenge the organization to create alternative pathways for inclusivity with alternative tracks for training ATs of color, and to change the rules and regulations and the policies around when an AT is appointed, because those are just barriers, socially, economically, and racially for ATs of color, for average ATs of color to become appointed. And if that's the track for leadership within the organization, well, then that's where the change needs to happen.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on hearing that. I mean, first of all, just there's there's one divide you talk about that I think really goes beyond anything within the Goenka organization. I think it's something you see across all levels and practices of Buddhism, and that's this challenge of trying to talk about the lived reality, the apparent reality, the superficial reality. There's different names that people give it: surface reality, and then the deeper reality, the deeper truths, the more subtle reality unfolding that meditation practice and insight starts to give. And I think that this is, and probably if we go beyond Buddhism, I think any truly spiritual practice, this becomes an issue that people have to navigate in terms of how do I live in this world? How am I just responsible for myself and for others in society at a basic level, and then interact with the same reality everyone else is interacting with? And then how do I use this practice to go beyond that and to learn deeper truths, but then very likely for most, if not all people, you have to come back at some level and still spend a large amount, if not the majority of your waking time in this lived superficial reality where maybe superficial is the wrong word because that sounds like it's not totally authentic. Maybe more of it's a surface reality of truths that are present that are no less undeniable and pertinent. But I think this split in terms of how do you understand for those that are trying to engage in a spiritual practice, and in this case in the practice of meditation or understand the Buddhist teachings, for people that are on that path, how do they continue to live in the society and among the concerns of their daily life, and when they go for these deeper truths, how do they then come back and integrate it? And that's, I think that's something you just see across the board, certainly in Buddhist forums that I'm aware of. When people talk about this, is just that dynamic between the deeper Buddhist truths, where you're really looking at what is the mind phenomenon, what is there's actually no difference between, you know, man and woman, or dog and person, or even living being and invisible being. And a lot of these things start to break down when you get to these deeper truths, but then you come back and man and woman and sexual orientation and race and nationality and these things, they do matter. They are real. To deny their existence, and this is actually a line that you had exactly in your letter, you talked about this experience of denying reality, of a practice that is actually denying the existence of a reality that's around us. And so that itself becomes a challenge in how to acknowledge these shared features of an objective reality that we're all living in, while simultaneously also going in and having these deeper meditative and spiritual and refined truths, and then coming back and integrating it. But
Yeah,
then
yeah,
if you
yeah.
take this kind of fundamental Buddhist element, or we could even say spiritual element, because I remember long before I started practicing meditation, my first exposure to this was reading the poetry of the Sufi Rumi. And Rumi just has this extraordinary, he's a Persian, I believe a Persian Sufi poet from hundreds of years ago. And just the way he would talk about, his analogy was always minding two shops, that we have to mind two shops, one being the spiritual truths, and the other being the shared lived reality. Going back to this closed loop system that is informed by the privilege and the purity of the narrative describing the technique, and the forces that went in their own telling to preserving and saving this technique as being the one thing that really leads to liberation. And here I make a footnote that, for people listening that are aware of the discourses, will say, no, 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 Goenka said at this time in this place that there are other techniques and there are other practices, and this is not the only one. Yes, that's what he said. But again, the take home message, really, despite these other scatterings of things that were said at different times, the take home message really for those that adhere and practice this is the purity of this practice of liberation really being superior than others. And also this inherent fear with that of needing to protect it, needing to keep the impure out, to maintain the whatever the guidelines of the practice are and the discipline, to maintain that as carefully as possible, because one small change in that discipline can lead to infection and impurity of the whole thing. And so there's this kind of charge on those in leadership and responsibility. And even I was never in a role of leadership, but even as an old student, I felt it as well, that this purity has to be maintained at all costs. And there are small threats and big threats that can come along to make this technique inaccessible and impure. And that's what's happened before, because that's what you're told as a member of the organization, that you're told that this did get impure and mixed with other things, so this time it cannot. And so I think part of the conversation you're having is being informed by this ultra concern to not deviate or do anything outside of the rigid structures that have been devised by Goenka. Even though you quote Goenka in the article, and you quote him, or in the letter you quote the post 9/11, I think there's still an extreme hesitancy to want to do anything that could be seen as a deviation. The final thing I was going to comment on from listening to the series of interactions you had, that also fit into this dynamic for me, is whataboutism. And whataboutism is something that I've become all too unfortunately familiar with the situation in Myanmar, because whataboutism is used so commonly by those who are trying to prevent change. And whataboutism is this concept where whenever you point to some specific problem that's happening somewhere, the response to it immediately becomes, well, what about this? What about that? What about this thing over there? And the things that are pointed to may or may not be comparable. They may or may not be legitimate things to look at, but the practice of whataboutism, and when you can identify whataboutism taking place, it's very helpful, because it could really cut through this kind of confusing line of argumentation. Whataboutism is a clever way of not looking or addressing the specific thing that one is bringing up and signifying as a point of concern, but being able to say, well, yeah, this might be legitimate, or this is very legitimate, but what about this, and what about that, and what about this as well? And that in the response that you gave from after sending the letter and receiving the feedback, is that in essence, you were talking about the specific existence of people of color in who are meditating in the Goenka tradition, perhaps not feeling safe, or having their voice heard, or feeling uncomfortable in different ways. And this is the specific thing that you're addressing, and also addressing a way that this can be handled and taken and responded to. And the response is very much a whataboutism. It's, well, what about the hatred that exists in the heart of men and women everywhere for others everywhere? This is a fundamental quality of the human mind, that there is this hatred and aversion. This is what the Buddha spoke to. Racism is one form of this dosa and this hatred that the Buddha talked about. This is a technique that goes into all of that. And so it's kind of a combination of factors of marrying a whataboutism argument into the power of this technique and practice, so that it remains inward turning. And one final thing I'll say before I turn it over to you, this is also a feature that I think goes into this as well, that we've talked about on these previous conversations. That's why it's so helpful to build to this moment, is that for myself and for many that come to the practice, there's this feeling of trying to find answers or peace through all these external activities. And the really appealing thing about a meditation practice is, finally, you're going to close your eyes. Finally, you're going to look inside. Finally, you're going to stop trying to fix everything outside of you and all these things you can't control. And you're going to pay attention to the one thing that you might actually have control over. And that's the observation of the mind and body. And so this is such a powerful instruction and reminder that it can be overemphasized, and it can be applied beyond its capacity to be effective. And that, this mindset of wanting to continue to focus on the practice and the internal state of mind, and to not try to, quote unquote, fix everything outside, that these things all come together to me in forming that answer. The purity of the technique, the fear tactics, and one to deviate from what we've been told this pristine purity of the technique is, combined with the whataboutism, and then combined with this emphasis again that we don't try to fix things outside. We come back to center, follow the practice, re-enter this closed loop where we cut off this peer engagement and critical examination. And the belief and the faith in the practice itself is what will deliver us to the kind of interaction and with others, as well as the greater purity inside that we're all striving for. So
I think that there's often this tendency for Dhamma organizations to put this kind of ultimate reality as a dismissal, really, of regular, it has an organization. And as I mentioned in this letter to this acharya, is that all human organizations they're of course they're flawed because they're human, right? But I feel that the Goenka tradition holds its own organization as kind of somehow above all that, and therefore not, and it ends up being really behind in terms of making these really critical changes that it does need to make to remain relevant, as an organization in society, as a Dhamma organization, as an organization that will continue to inspire people with the ideals that it inspired you and I with, and in that sense of transformation. Because if you're not willing to transform your own organization that you've created, how are you going to remain relevant to people today?
Yeah, and I think hitting upon that fear of other traditions or being contaminated or whatnot, it reminded me of when we were looking at I was looking with some other meditators at the rules of, like, if you do this infraction, this is how much you have to wait for, either to serve a course, or this is what you have to do to get back on track, basically. And when you look at the long course system, which is what many people want to be enrolled in, want to be on that track, if I believe if you were to experiment with any other kind of technique, even insofar as, I mean, it depends on who you talk to, but in some cases, just so much of just learning about, just in the course of a day, learning about another way of breathing or another way of observation, and just learning that and applying it and trying it out, or something longer, that this would then be a 2-year wait from the time that you did this dalliance and experiment to the time that you could that you could then go sit another long course. It was a 2-year break. However, if you broke one of the five Shila, it was a 1-year break. And so I remember joking with friends that you imagine one meditator going in to meet with a teacher and saying, like, oh, well, I met this monk somewhere in Thailand or Burma, and he told me this way of observing this or that, and I tried it for a few days. Be like, oh wow, that's quite serious. Like, you have to wait 2 years before you could sit a long course. Then you have the next person come in and say, well, I got a hold of some stolen meth and then used it while I was cheating on my spouse, and then lied about it to my spouse. And, oh, I killed a couple insects on the way out. So basically, in this one act, you've broken 5 precepts. And the response from the teacher would be like, well, that's not great. You have to wait a year before you can go and sit a long course. So basically, the breaking of those 5 precepts, it gives you a 1-year punishment or ban or penalty box before you can go back into the long course. But
Right, right.
having any experience with another tradition is a 2-year wait. And so this in and of itself, by the very nature of the rules, expose the thinking of how extremely dangerous and suspicious any activity with any other kind of technique is seen.
Well, and I love this satire of, the rules and regulations, because again, when you become obsessed with these kinds of rules and regulations, they're inevitably going to contradict each other, right? There and but the what's we were talking about the take home message last time. What's the take home message here? It's kind of an infantilization of students. It's a kind of an inherent distrust of students, to follow their own wisdom, to make choices. And then, but it also ends up, whether or not it's intended to be, it ends up being internalized as a kind of a punishment, right? And that you are somehow not fit or not good enough to belong because you did something that may actually have been, okay, not in the case of the, the breaking the precepts, but say, you felt like, okay, let me go study anapana with, with a nun. Like,
Mhm.
like, why is that? If this is the teachings of the Buddha, how can that be against, you know, a tradition representing it as the teachings of the Buddha? How can that be against it? Only because that tradition has branded their technique and has this exclusive policy around it, right? But that's not the intention of the Buddha. The Buddha didn't intend to exclude people. It was, I mean, he had essentially an army of both lay and monastics, men and women, teaching different levels of Dhamma to
Right.
everyone, and let
Mhm.
and go forth for the benefit of all, like everybody, right? But yeah, I mean, just this morning, my wife Carolyn was mentioning that she, toward the end here, when she was looking at this other tradition where a nun was teaching Anapana, and she said, "Oh, I can't do that because if I do,
Mhm.
I'll be thrown out."
Mm. And in some ways, I think this even causes like a sense of, well, it definitely causes a sense of mistrust or suspicion into wanting to be interested in that. And I would say whether one wants to be interested in another technique or in understanding the elements of institutional racism or many other things, I think that this is an inherent sign indication that somehow the meditation is not enough. And because the narrative of how it's framed, and this is an intentional choice. There are other traditions, many other traditions, that don't frame it this way, but because so much weight has intentionally been chosen to frame this technique, not as something that's generally helpful, or not as something that will be, some people will find, very useful, but as something that is really the one perfect thing for everyone out there, if they're mentally strong enough to be able to hang in, that looking at alternatives is an admission that either you are not good enough for this practice or organization, or the practice or organization is not good enough for you. And so that itself kind of engenders this fear of, and even self-censorship in wanting to go and explore not just other traditions, but even other discourses, even other ways of framing the Dhamma. And, this goes back to one, I think I told one anecdote before about how I had met a meditator couple from the Goenka tradition in Burma at one time, and I gave them a book on the teachings of Utejaniya, and both the couple read it, and they said they were both incredibly upset reading the book because they gained wisdom from it. And they were being very open and vulnerable with me and talking about this, so I appreciate that. But because they had gained a sense of wisdom in a Buddhist teaching, or a Vipassana teaching, if one will, that was not Goenka, and had given them food for thought and things they'd never thought of before and that were helpful, they felt incredibly unpleasant and uncomfortable that they had done this, almost guilty even in a way. It also reminds me of a senior student I know who sat many long courses that I turned on to, Thanisara Bhikkhu, Ajahn Jeff, as he's also known. And he just got big time into, reading about him and reading his discourses. And his sister is an AT, a very prominent AT. And he would describe how when a sister came to his house, they would literally hide the books of Thanisara Bhikkhu they were reading because he was embarrassed to admit that he was looking at this. At one point, he went to living in California. He visited Wat Metta in Southern California, where Thanisara Bhikkhu's monastery is based. And it was like a top secret trip that he was going out to go and meet him in person. He wasn't even practicing anything, just simply being exposed to these ideas was somewhat shameful and fearful and paranoid in, first giving himself permission to stray that way, not stray in terms of technique again, but stray in terms of the input he was getting. He didn't even want to reveal that or expose that. But then once he gave himself that permission, he couldn't talk about it. I mean, he was literally going to lengths of hiding books when his sister came over so that it wouldn't be apparent.
Right. And I think, this happens a lot because of the obsession of rules and regulations. I mean, you get so many old students who, because of their desire to belong, to sit retreats, to sit longer retreats, they end up, putting down false information on their applications so that they can get in. And this happens at every level. I mean, I know, senior ATs, acharyas, and regular ATs who all have to not be honest in order to actually sit their long courses. And you could argue, you say, well, that's their volition, and they're gonna go, they're gonna be producing karma for that. But you also need to look at the organization that is obsessing so much with so many different kinds of rules and regulations that you end up making compromises like this, right? And just like the example that you gave, right, in terms of what kind of consequence there will be for breaking a precept versus doing another technique, and how kind of arbitrary that is and how random that is. And yet people, because they have their sincere desire to belong to an organization, to a sangha, they will break these rules and they will take that risk in order to belong. And that speaks to the power of our human need to belong, and what can go wrong with that when that need is kind of conscripted and constrained by so many different kinds of just rigidity, really, and these ultimate truths that are offered as ways of sort of dismissing what you may know to be true, either on an emotional basis or on a social basis. and that would, compel you to act otherwise. But you're saying, oh, no, no, it's okay. It's all impermanent. It's all anicca. We don't have to do anything. Just send metta, just
Mhm.
send love, just send loving kindness, and it will all get taken care of.
Mhm.
And that's just what I realized is that as I began to do these trainings, I was like, oh yeah, it's sitting on the cushion is not alone going to take me out of my own prejudice and bias. It's one component that will, but I also have to have conversations, and I have to be exposed and educated and challenged and made
Mhm.
uncomfortable.
Mhm.
And those are all the very things that the organization is saying, no, we're not going to sponsor that, because that's not our mission. That's not Goenkaji's mission. That's separate from the Dhamma, and that's separate from or should be separate from our organization. And yet, you know, structural racism was happening in the organization. And yet those are the things that are going to be effective to turn that around. And I'm the first person. I'm not the first. I'll be the first person to say, I'm a racist. I am conditioned, in the sense that I am conditioned by my society. I'm not
Mhm.
exempt. And so an organization of human beings, predominantly white, human beings, is also not going to be exempt from that conditioning, and it's going to manifest in with all our collective white blind spots in our organization. And to not want to be motivated to look at that and to is yeah so this was a kind of a culminating moment
Mhm.
and I was just admitting my own shortcomings here. I was getting increasingly frustrated with the pace of reception, the pace of resistance, the pace of change, and saying to myself, "Yeah, I'm not sure that I can represent this organization." But like I said at the end of the last, uh, you know, our last session, that wasn't actually what then, uh, propelled me to leave. It was a huge part of it, and it was, but it ended up that really, uh, it was my last 3 or 4 10-day courses that actually were what propelled me to want to leave the organization. And we can talk about how, because I think a lot of these pieces that we're talking about, these consequences of that emotional bypass, are actually rooted in the very practice itself. And the framework of this purification process that we've talked about before, I began to see that, wait a second, okay, that, yes, I do believe that that's a valid path, a valid framework, but it's not the only framework. When you read the Pali Canon, it's not the only framework that the Buddha taught. And I, there's another piece here that I want to kind of bring up, which is, you know, the Goenka's tradition's propensity to kind of put Goenka's take on the teachings above the Pali Canon, and in some ways above the Buddha. And that it was seen that it's kind of that sort of sense of the pure, pristine practice, and Goenkaji as an a question that, as a figure that cannot be questioned. That the combination of those two things is like you're elevating the tradition really above the Dhamma as a broad path, as a broad spiritual path, that encompasses many, many different traditions.
Uh, yeah, and I think this also goes back to the concern I mentioned on a previous conversation that we had, where to me, one of the real challenges is that this was presented as a panacea for everything, that whatever your ills, this will cure it. This is not quite a miracle cure, because you have to work very hard for it and you have to really commit yourself. But if you, the contract is, if you exert yourself and follow the rules and discipline and the organizational standards and such in your daily life, and as well as at the center, to this degree, then sooner or later these defilements will come up and be revealed and be and go away forever, and you'll be free of them. And so I think one of the challenges is in that, in this decision to very intentionally use language that made the entire organizational mission and technique a panacea for everything that would come in, that right then and there intentionally limits any conversation you could have about what it's not fulfilling. And if it was simply framed in a different way, if it was simply framed as this is something that is good up to this point, or is helpful for some kinds of people, or is following this practice to some degree will give you this kind of benefit, but you also, as with anything else, you use your own, you kind of have the freedom and agency to be able to incorporate this with the other things that you choose to, then these conversations could happen. But because of the way that it was framed initially, whether one is talking about engagement with racism, engagement in Myanmar towards the coup, with any aspect of the practice or the teachers or the teaching or the organization or the technique, any discussion, whether it's a serious topic or something minor, becomes an immediate threat to the overriding message that this will cure and take care of everything. And that then becomes, to me, just a really kind of, as I've thought about this over the years, a really kind of depressing and pessimistic outlook, that this is kind of a built-in mechanism for ever preventing discussion or feedback or critical thought or engagement or anything else, because any step on this path of conversation immediately is starting to poke holes in something that is aiming towards a perfection and becomes that threat. And so I don't know how you can even have this conversation unless the parties that you're having the conversation with are coming to the table willing to admit that they might not be in the possession of something that is aiming towards perfection, or that is perfection, or that is pristine purity preserved for, whatever their historical narrative kind of fabricates the lineage to be. If you are coming with those attachments in mind, whatever the conversation is, this conversation you're bringing to it is just what you happen to confront. There's many other things that one can talk about and be concerned about and express consideration for. I don't know how any topic ever gets off the ground when people coming to the table are coming with that kind of belief.
The belief of
The belief of that belief of perfection, the belief of pristine purity, the
yeah,
belief
right.
that
Yeah,
nothing needs to be added or taken away, and Goenka's interpretation is all you need, because any little thing that you're poking at,
right. Yeah,
even no matter how small it is, becomes a threat
right.
to the whole system that was created and that people abide by.
Well, and there's that belief in that perfection, and then there is the prohibition around actually having open conversation or open dialogues or group discussions that would question any of the main tenets of that sort of purification system. So I think that's the other piece, is that yeah, there's this currency that in order to belong, in order to stay in, you need to have this level of faith, this understanding that this is the purest path, that this organization is charged with representing the truest Dhamma on the planet. And if you don't have those, then you're increasingly on peripheral levels going out, and that, the more you have, the further in and included you are. And the less you have, the more out you have. And then there are, specific lines of being in and out, right?
Hmm.
And I think that, yeah, it's predicated on that sense of, so when you begin to, when you do begin to poke those holes, and we begin to actually question critically, first of all, there, like I think we referred to in our last session, there's this unbelievable fear that comes up, right? Like, oh my God, I can't question this. I can't question the practice. I can't question the organization. I can't question an acharya. And I can't have side conversations that maybe, with other official representatives of the organization, because that's a group discussion. And so all these sort of strictures that then are in place. But when you begin to poke those holes, it really creates a sense of dissonance that is hard to resolve. It's hard to find resolution with inside the organization.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. Moving along your personal journey of You talk about writing this letter and wanting an engagement, wanting a discussion, and then eventually we know that happened. We know that eventually you did leave. Can you fill us in what happened in between and what brought about that decision?
Yeah. So Carolyn and I have a son, Julian, and he is now 10 years old. And but for most of the last 10 years, we were just struggling to be able to even sit retreats, just because when you have an infant and a toddler, it's just really super hard. So, I think we were doing 3-day retreats at times, tag teaming. We kind of eventually it grew to being able that we were able to tag team, each of us doing maybe 5 days, then 7 days, and finally being able to get to a point where we could actually sit 10 days again as parents. And gosh, yeah, that's a whole other section of just how unconducive this tradition is for families.
Mm.
That's a whole other topic, but yeah, I mean, so we began to do 10-day courses again, and this was at a point where our practice was actually not, you know, we our daily practice had really suffered a lot during this time. I mean, on one level, I say that by the measurement of the Goenka tradition, we weren't sitting 2 hours a day, and at one point we actually, we actually. We felt, okay, well, we need to just tell this to our senior acharyas who appointed us, because we're not keeping up with the basic requisites of being an assistant teacher, and we offered to step down, just to take a break. We're full time workers, and we have a family. So, and much to our actually surprise, they said, no, we want you to continue. We were still serving the center in different capacities, as teachers. Were overseeing the servers who were long term at the center, or just in the sense of just touching base with them as their as assistant teachers, who would just see how they were progressing, what challenges they were facing, that sort of thing, just counseling them basically. Um, and they, yeah, to our surprise, they said, no, we want you to continue doing that service, and we understand you're limited right now, because you have a family, and that situation will change. And so it was kind of amazing, because we were just so surprised by that exception to this pretty hard and fast rule around the requisites for being an assistant teacher, which is that the same for being able to sit long courses, which is which is the same for being a trustee. In the tradition, you have to sit 2 hours a day, and I think the assumption is, of course, that you, after sitting so many retreats and having so much confidence in this practice, that's just going to become natural for you and a given for you. And whatever lifestyle changes you have to make to accommodate that, you will have done by the time you're in a position of being considered for more responsibilities within the tradition. So, I think this was like the first time in my adult life that I just struggled and was buckling under and couldn't keep up a daily practice. And the same for my wife Carolyn. And we felt like we needed to come clean and just say, yeah, okay, this is where we're at. Maybe this is not a good time for us to be assistant teachers. And so we were totally surprised. To be honest, it was kind of a shot in the arm, just for them to have that kind of confidence, say, yeah, okay, we're going to make an exception for you, continue serving, even though you're not sitting 2 hours a day. And it was like, it just was such a breather, in the sense of, like, it actually gave me even confidence in the whole organization. There are some case by case exceptions here, and this there can be a lack of a lack of that rigidity that we see so prevalent all the time, and here it was an exception to that. And so but it also put us in an interesting position where a couple things. We were then we then could accept more. Like, I mean, when you stop when you stop doing your practice, right? The tendency is just to beat yourself up about it, right? Like, just like, oh my God, I missed my sitting. I'm going to go to a hell realm or whatever. My karma is just going to, I'm, not going to come back as a human being or whatever. I'm not going to be able to practice Dhamma in my next lifetime. All these messages, just these extreme messages, are the ways we internalize these rules and regulations in the Goenka tradition at these kind of sort of in response to these sort of rigid things around, what daily practice should look like, right? And it's a high bar, right? The Goenka tradition is a very high bar. I don't think there are many other traditions that will say, yeah, you have to do 2 hours to belong but to be a representative in Goenkas, you have to do 2 hours a day. And again, supposedly by the time you're in a position of being, asked to be in those positions, it's assumed that you will have accommodated that and are motivated and want to do that. But the reality is also that people plateau, people get unmotivated, people struggle through their group sittings. I mean, I know so many assistant teachers who struggle with that obligation and struggle with making it come alive. And despite all the responses, scripted or unscripted, from Goenkaji or other AT colleagues, they are very uninspired by their practice. And but this is all to say that we had to kind of come to grips with the shoulds around that, within the way we had internalized that. What it actually, after kind of getting over feeling like a fraud as an AT, because here I would, go to the center and maybe even say to newer students, well, yes, it's really important that you have a 2-hour, sitting a day. I felt, I obviously felt like a fraud for a while doing that, right? But the other consequence of that was that in some ways I was, for the first time, able to relax in terms of my practice, because on some level, even though it was, not transparent and it wasn't, declared, I had permission, essentially, or an okay, if I didn't sit 2 hours a day, from my appointing acharya. And I hope this doesn't get him in trouble, but it was actually a wonderful moment in our practices, because I think our practices actually relaxed. We kind of relaxed off of that rigidity and that kind of stern, that internalized verk, kind of, voice of Goenkajis that we've, most Goenkaji students have internalized, and so by the time I began to sit my 10-day courses again, I think that, and this actually began, I think, in 2019. I had some experiences that on the last 3 10-day courses, where particularly I think it was in the sort of the concentration stage during Anapana, where I was having experiences that were very much sort of departure experiences in terms of my own concentration. Just profound experiences of concentration that I had no words for, and that was just kind of startling, and it was as if I had stumbled upon it. Now I understand that it may well have been caused because, in fact, I had relaxed in my practice. But what was amazing to me was that, after a long period of time of not having a daily practice and going to a 10-day course, that not only was my practice so strong and so profound, but it had kind of broken through some boundaries, at least in my mind, about levels of concentration that I could experience. I mean, looking back now, again, people may be thinking, "Oh, I'm referring to the jhanas," and I'm not actually. These were definitely, I would say, probably just deeper levels of concentration that I just hadn't previously experienced, and didn't feel. I think coming out of those experiences, the first thing I realized was, I didn't feel like I could actually talk to anybody about them. I didn't feel like there was anyone who I could talk to who wouldn't in some way, either like there would be some self-consciousness around calling attention to it, some, assumption of, my ego around calling attention to it, or that I was going to get a canned response. well, just ignore that, just, come back to sensations and, um, and, there had been, as an AT, I would get AT reports out of India, and there were, there were actually um, Q&As that were sent out where the question is, well, what happens if my student is going into the first jhana? And the answer is, well, steer them away from that, get them out of that. They should, bring them back to going through the body part to part, part by part. And that's one of the techniques that Goenka employs. And so it was this complete, dismissal of the jhanas, right? And so I was aware that that was likely, that minimization, that dismissal, that absolute rejection of that experience was going to be essentially the response that I got. And yet the experience was so profound that I couldn't ignore it. And I had to basically begin to kind of go back to some of the Pali Canon to kind of understand what my experience was. And to readings, outside of the tradition to really understand, okay, what was this? And that said a lot to me. That said a lot, that there wasn't after 35 years, there wasn't anyone that I could, maybe with one exception or two exceptions, I couldn't really sort of speak to what I was experiencing and how dramatic it was, how profound it was, how it was really, it really brought me to this place of being completely enthralled with my practice, almost like a new student again. And yet I felt very alone with that experience. And I was aware that, many others had some kind of self-reported breakthrough experience and had reported it to an AT and, had it, dismissed or, minimized in some way, or, and these are students like lived experiences, and yet if it doesn't kind of follow the way that this, I'm just going to say it, this sort of branded technique is taught, there's no place for exploring, examining, or really in some ways affirming those kinds of experiences, because it's all again seen, in the light of, this is just impermanent, you don't get attached. But when I began to actually read the Pali Canon around some of these experiences, I thought, oh, no, these are things that the Buddha taught. And because these were deeper concentrations, and I was reading about the jhanas, I came across passages in the Pali Canon where the Buddha explicitly says, the jhanas are not to be feared. He says that, pretty much word for word, and that the pleasure of the jhanas is not a sensual pleasure. He termed it a spiritual pleasure, if you read the Pali. And he says, this is a pleasure that I permit. And, Goenka gives fairly short shrift to the jhanas in his long courses, even though students actually may well, and I think he's acknowledging that they may well actually stumble upon them. But he really minimizes them in overall. And of course, as I just mentioned, in terms of, AT practices or best practices coming out of India, they're completely minimized. So, I had to, that was just another place where, again, what I had been taught, within the parameters and the framework of Goenka tradition was completely askew to what I was reading in the Pali Canon. And that dissonance was just really too great to bear, for me. I was just like, wait a second, given how profound this experience of concentration was for me, and that I really felt like I needed to pursue it. I just said, okay, this, but it brought into light other things. By this point I was in a Dhamma study group. I was reading the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the middle length discourses of the Pali Canon, systematically. And we were just seeing as a group, like, sutta after sutta after sutta, how much the Buddha mentions the role that the deeper concentrations, known as the jhanas, these absorption concentrations, hold. And again, I want to be very clear. I do not feel like I experienced absorption concentration by any means. But what happened for me was profound enough to need to explore that area. And I knew immediately that that meant that that was going to take me out of the tradition.
Right. Thanks for sharing all that. I think one thing that comes up as I hear that is just this question, which I think is really important to examine for a moment before taking the next step in your journey, which is the definition of what is in and out in the Goenka tradition. I think in other spiritual slash religious organizations, membership is really clearly defined and stages of membership is also defined. With this organization, I think it's much more challenging to really sometimes even know what in and out means. I think for you, the one real difference and distinction with you is with many, many other people who are part of the organization is you have a very clearly defined role. And so you can theoretically you can leave your role but stay in the organization, but you do have to give some sort of information or clarification about to what degree you're taking on that role. But I think for others, well, to back up a minute, this is an organization which does not really require any, or doesn't require in any form any kind of monetary payment whatsoever. So there's no dues that one has to pay. I mean, dues is also paying some kind of fee is certainly one act of gatekeep. Either you pay the fee or you don't, and you're in or you're out that way. You have access or you don't have access. There can be requirements in terms of activities or responsibilities or roles that one takes on. But to a large part in the Goenka organization, you could be, as it was in my case, sitting many, many years involved in serving more courses than I can count, doing long courses, engaging and prioritizing the practice in every way that I could for many, many years. And yet it wouldn't really make sense for me to talk about formally leaving because there was nothing really to leave. I mean, it was really just like, do I want to be involved more? Or do I want to be involved less? And if I want to be involved less, is that going to be an extended break, or is that going to be, am I going to claim that that's going to be a forever break? And, we'll see how it happens. Or, there's certainly no announcement that ever needs, in my case, there's certainly no kind of pronouncement or announcement I would never need to make. I mean, that'd be kind of strange, even given how involved I was. Who would I announce it to, and what would it matter to them? So you don't really have these kind of in an inside outside in the elite of the organization. Perhaps we have that with the Goenka organization, but in terms of just being in or out, it doesn't really function how other organizations do unless you have a vested role, unless you have a clear responsibility, and then you have to alert if you're no longer doing that responsibility. But as I said, you can also step down from that role but stay engaged in some form in the practice. And so
Right.
I wonder if you can just pick up this conversation of
Yeah.
what your
Yeah.
understanding has been of in and out, and where you saw yourself in this dichotomy, and then with that understanding of where you saw your placement on the in and out spectrum, what steps you decided to take formally or informally to in your journey.
Yeah, a great question. And I think I just want to sort of state at the outset to sort of frame this, that the fact that there is an in and out, I think, is one of the more painful pieces of the tradition. Um, but it begins, I think, with Goenkaji's on his 10-day courses. By toward the end, he clearly lets out, sort of reveals sort of the currency of one definition of inclusion, which is that um, having, there's two yardsticks, he says, to the progress on the path. One is selfless service, and the other is gratitude. And as one hears that over and over and over again, and as one begins to, oh yeah, well, I should really serve a course, and then you serve more courses, and it's a positive experience to serve and volunteer on the retreats. But you know, eventually, if you want to go deeper and you want to sit the long courses, I mean, the other piece is that, uh, you know, even actually um, sitting a long retreat is predicated upon serving at least one 10-day course. So there is this notion of, oh, we don't want students who are just sitting retreat after retreat after retreat, course after course after course. We want people to be realizing that this value of selfless service is really part of the path, but it's also, in this case, it's also part of the currency to belong in the tradition. And so, by the time you sitting your first 30-day course, which is also by the time you maybe, it's pretty public these days that once you've sat a 30-day course, you're being looked at potentially to be considered as an AT, or being asked to train up and then be appointed as an AT. And that's just because of the sheer demand for courses and centers out there, and that there's not enough ATs to fulfill that. So, whereas when I was growing up in the tradition, you could sit many long 20-day, 30-day, 45-day courses and not even get a whiff of a hint that you were being looked at as an AT. But now the demand is so great that you are being looked at, and so typically, by the time you are sitting your first 30-day, you have served a number of courses or are involved, and there is that kind of sort of gradual, you might say, Trojan horse, phenomenon of funneling in towards the organization and doing the things that would define belonging, right? Which is, again, if the yardstick is this sense of selfless service and this gratitude, this overall faith in the practice and the teacher, and then there's a kind of a subtle messaging that's going on there, and a subtle, you could even call it a conditioning around that, a shaping of to be socialized, to be in rather than out. And but the reality is that, again, as I've mentioned before, we determined just by going through the database that really 90% of all students don't come back after their third retreat. And progressively, by the time you're sitting a long course, it's like there's only 2% of the student database that's sitting long courses, and that would be considered to be an assistant teacher or some other consequential representative. And those are the folks, that 2% is the folks that's operating the entire apparatus, because those are the folks who are trusted to be on the inside, right? Those are the folks who are in. And so by that point, I think by the time you're really representing it, that's the definition of in. And that means you may have disagreements with some of the pieces, and you may have even disagreement with the fundamentalism that you observe, or the rigidity that you see, or the esotericness that you get wind of, around reincarnation or past lives, or paramis or karma, or you may have questions of all those things. You may just be like, I'm just here to improve my daily life. That's it. That's all I care about. But if you're still fulfilling all these other criteria for being in, then you're in, and no one's going to, as long as you can, sort of profess your faith in following all the strictures, and that you're exclusively following this technique, then you're on the inside. It's only when you demonstrate that you're not surrendered to Goenkaji and to the technique that you are considered more peripheral or on the outside. So, what I realize is that most Dhamma organizations out there, most traditions, now that I've sort of pervaded a lot of them, they're much more porous than that. If I'm applying to sit even a 30-day now, I don't have to profess any exclusive surrender to a teacher. They might ask me, well, what's your experience sitting? And of course, someone like me, I've done a lot of retreats. So yeah, okay, I may be accepted because of that, but I don't have to declare this sort of exclusive surrender to a teaching or to path. So most Dhamma organizations are way more porous than Goenkaji's. That sense of in and out does not exist. In fact, they're very generous in the sense that if you're sitting retreats in any tradition, you're doing the work. You're on the path. It's a very much more of an you might say a fellowship and a broader ecumenical kind of fellowship around just being on the path. But with Goenkaji's, it's not that's not the case. You have to be in, and and um, and so it brings up the whole notion of people feeling like you feel it, right? You feel whether you're how in you are, how much on the periphery you are, and the currency of that, and the elevation of people who are more on the end, And I certainly felt like I bought into all of that. I'm not gonna deny my own desire to have to want to have been an assistant teacher in the tradition. After so many years, I thought, oh, and some of it was a pure volition to just want to serve in that way after being served so much in that way. And yet, there's also you're observing what's going on in the tradition. It's very hierarchical. You see where the influence is, and it's in these positions of representation. And so there is this ladder in the organization, whether it's spoken or unspoken. And even if it's said, well, we don't, if you want to be an assistant teacher, that's likely going to show that you're ineligible or not fit to be one if you really want to be one. But that denies, again, we're talking about the ultimate denying the commonplace or conventional. Most people, of course, you can sniff that out right away. That the desire, and want to have that sense of achievement, sense of value around serving, and also recognition, for that you've done all these retreats and that you're in, and yet if you somehow display that, that's a notion that you're not really actually fit to do that. So what people end up doing, of course, is stuffing any display of that and creating sort of false humility around that, and then just waiting and hoping and that they'll be seen and recognized and whatever, and then still pretending that they don't really care or whatever. But it's listen, I didn't meet, well, there was one, I met one person, I think, who had reached liberation, in India. I didn't meet anyone in the West in Goenka teach tradition who, was known to be liberated or seemed to be liberated. And so, if you're not liberated, of course, there's going to be these basic ego desires, right? Around recognition, around belonging, around all of that piece. And I think, this is where I think the lack of sort of transparency around that just can really skew what choices people make, and around what they need to declare in order to do a long course, and then how they need to subscribe to this exclusive branded practice in order to be a representative.
Right. And just curious, you're talking about these other traditions you've explored that don't have that same requirement on belonging, or I should say the prerequisite that in order to get the benefit of what they're going to offer, you need to first meet the requirements of belonging. And I would argue in the Goenka case, those requirements of belonging, some of them are written down. Some of them are written down in the sense of the
Application form.
the application form, yeah, and the rules. Some of them are invisible. Some of them are things that are never really talked about or quantified, but are just things that everyone knows that adopting this attitude or engaging like this or not like this will lead to more of a place of belonging. But what do you think the reasons are for why in these other traditions you've explored there hasn't been this premium on belonging, and where with Goenka it's not just a premium, but it's actually really a prerequisite for further engagement?
I think it's because there's an acknowledgement that the path of Dhamma is great and broad and vast and inclusive. And I think it's because if you're whether you're practicing anapana or you are practicing with another object of concentration, or whether you are focused on, you know, you know, other objects of meditation, say, other than the three that Goenkaji sort of permit, really, anapana, physical sensations, and the four Brahma Vihara, if that there's much more than all of those out there, and that they're all valid, and so there's this inclusivity, and there's not this sense of that we're only teaching this one small interpretation, this thin slice of the Dhamma, and that this is what we're calling the only path, or the pure and pristine path, or the superior path of Dhamma. People outside of Goenka tradition just look at Goenka tradition as a very insular organization that is not kind of, you might say, playing collegially in the sandbox, in the greater Dhamma sandbox. It's just narrowed things down, and I think maybe for the full acharyas who had that contact, really long-standing contact with Goenkaji, that was extremely inspiring. I mean, there's no doubt his presence was extremely inspiring and transformative just to be around. But for today's, since he's passed away, most students are not going to experience that. And then when you combine that with the resources that are available to understanding the Dhamma, that are just with a click of a button on the internet, you're comparing a very small slice of the Dhamma and then it kind of begs the question, how do you get away with sort of proclaiming this one small slice as the only way, or the pure pristine way?
And then looking on the flip side, why do you think it is that within the organization they do put such a high premium on belonging and meeting these requirements of being inside before you can get the benefit, unlike some of these other practices that you explored later?
Well, I think Goenkaji laid those things down. I think he laid those down. As I think as he began the popularity of his teaching career. I mean, you saw some points where he took decisions. He was initially associated with, for example, both Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield were students of his, and Sharon Salzberg. And there was a lot of overlap, right? One of Sayagyi's students, Robert Hover, was one of the early founders of IMS, the Insight Meditation Society. There was, in those days, in the 70s or late 70s and early 80s, there was a lot more overlap between these traditions. But you saw, Goenkaji beginning to, remove himself from associations, sometimes because of financial reasons. Some traditions decided to charge rather than work on a donation basis. But in some ways, that there was a kind of, I don't know. I feel that it began it created, I guess, an insular culture, as other traditions that had that overlap with Goenkas in the early days got separated out. He also did that with Mother Sayama, who was teaching at Sayagyi Center after Sayagyi died, and began to create centers outside of Burma, outside of Myanmar. And these separations, and then it was like, okay, you can't do this. You can only, if you're with Goenka, you had to make a choice. I know acharyas who landed at the center in India when those separations were happening, and they had to make they had to make choices, and they were painful choices. And so, that sense of in and out, I think it began really with Goenkaji setting up his branding, really, in many ways, the distinctions of what he was teaching, I think unfortunately it got elevated to a point where it just excluded or invalid. It began to invalidate, as in the culture, all other practices, which I think is just very. I think it works against the tradition.
Right. And so you reference how these teachers that were in India had to make these painful decisions at the time that happened. You had to make your own painful decision, and where this conversation's been leading up to it. But I think now we're at that culminating point of, looking at both the discussions that we're having around the nature of the organization and your growing concerns, understanding that, and then also the physical trajectory of having these concerns about how they're not responding in the moment in 2020 with the police violence and racial discrimination. Can you walk us through the culminating experience to decide to leave, both for you and your wife, as well as the experience of leaving and the aftermath since then?
Sure, I'll do my best. One thing that had happened was that a very dear friend of mine, who actually has you've worked with, and I think who's been on some of your sessions, Aisha Shahida Simmons. She had made a decision to leave the organization due to structural racism issues about a year and a half before I did, and just as I had watched other folks leave over so many years, and knew what the kind of organizational response to that was, and also in some cases knew what those students went through in leaving. I I watched and was in touch with Aisha on her experience leaving, and it was extremely painful, and it was extremely painful for me to hear her experience over that year and a half. And I still felt during that year and a half, I thought, okay, I can make a difference. And in the case of the structural racism issues, I thought, well, on behalf of Aisha, I want to do everything I can to know that I did everything I can to have pushed this issue and move the needle. If in fact the decision I'm going to take is to leave. So yeah, it's a very disorienting experience to leave the tradition. I left people who I felt I was family with. I left a place. um, VMC in Shelburne Falls was like my home. I grew up there. I watched, trees that were less, smaller than I was grow to be these huge trees. I watched it go from a retreat center that, was only doing like 40 students when I first started to a retreat center that has accommodation for 150, twice a month, over 3,000 people going every year. I watched building after building after building. I helped nail those nails. It was. I had a sense of place there. I had a sense of growing up there, and it was profoundly. It was so disorienting to leave, to think about leaving, that when I actually did leave, I didn't know whether I could even. I actually live about a 7-minute walk from there. I didn't know whether I could go, literally walk over there and say goodbye, to the pagoda that I had helped build, or to the grounds and the trails that I had walked, or to the garden space that I had grown there. There were so many pieces to that were just profoundly sad to leave, to think about leaving, um, and it was disorienting. So it wasn't like it wasn't that I had a place that I knew I was going to when I left. I just knew that I was no longer going to get the support on the path of Dhamma that I needed while staying there. And the experience of trying to make what I thought, were necessary and skillful changes in the organization. The level of resistance and just the frustration I had, I just knew that it wasn't going to happen within a time frame that I felt good about representing anymore. And but yeah, I didn't have a place I was going to. I didn't have another new sangha. I didn't have this sense of a worldwide mission. All those pieces were leaving, and then my, just even my own experience with Goenkaji. I certainly was on a later wave of folks who had contact with him, but my contact with him was really extremely meaningful, very personal at times, and just extremely inspiring. I traveled with him a lot in two different countries on his tours. Spent a lot of time at his center in India, um, and you know, uh, opened up centers with his blessings in India. Did sort of the work of just opening up centers on behalf of the tradition. And so, yeah, I mean, one of the most amazing experiences ever that I had was just uh, at the second, retreat, 10-day course that we did in the Donaldson Correctional Facility in Alabama. Goenkaji walked in. I think I mentioned that he walked into at the end of that retreat and delivered the metta, and it was just such an incredible crowning achievement. Just around watching Goenkaji walk through those corridors and into that hall, and to serving those men, and being a part of that was just so moving and so profound. And Yeah, so it's lonely to leave. It's extremely isolating and lonely to leave. You leave behind your community in some ways. You feel like you are now on the out, and that's a painful place to be. It's a very painful place to be. Um, you know, um, yeah. I mean, I think you also have similar experiences of that, Joa.
Mm, yeah, I mean, I think I know from talking to you and Aisha that your departure was formal in a certain way, and was came in the form of an announcement of some kind, not not a press release, but some kind of formal declaration. And I think I I think you know I've this is it's hard, it's very hard to talk about, it's extremely hard to talk about, and it's something that I've never been asked this, and so I don't even really know how to address it. So I think so maybe I'll just kind of pick off from some period and just kind of see where that goes, because I don't have any lines like you two have. It's I think for in some of these stories I've already told. I mean, I was in, to recap for listeners who haven't, who don't know much about me or the platform, or who haven't listened to our previous conversation. I was in Burma for 15 years. The reason I went to Burma was purely 100% because I was a Goenka meditator and I wanted to see where these teachings came from. I went in 2003 after sitting a Satipatthana course in Thailand with Daniel Stewart, who is now a scholar. He's also been on the podcast. I took a flight with Jared Newell, who I've also done a podcast with, so people can go back and listen to these different parts of the stories. And in 2003, I just felt overwhelmed by what I saw as this Dhamma society that was everything that Goenka described, and that had these lineage figures and these historical sites I wanted to access. And yet culture, language, religion, custom, so many things. I knew it was there. I didn't know how to get there. And I desperately wanted to come back. I was very fortunate to get a job through my field in education at the US Embassy, which brought me back there in 2007, and went on exploring these traditions as much as I could and growing in understanding and awareness and knowledge every year by year. And that after my job ended at the embassy, I started to do more research. And at this point, I was keeping a blog online, but I didn't think it had any readers. I didn't even really understood how the internet worked, because I was in Burma at the time. That from 2007 I was in Burma, so the whole tech revolution that was happening around the world, I didn't know what was happening. I didn't have phones. I'd never seen a smartphone. I didn't understand how YouTube worked. None of this. So for me, the online blog was just kind of an exercise myself in being able to write about my experiences. and share what I was thinking and learning. It developed quite a following, which has led eventually to Insight Myanmar podcast, completely unbeknownst to me. And over time, the writing that I was doing ended up becoming messages that were forwarded to meditators coming about where to go and what was important. That then became a document that I worked on, and then it became a book. And then Pariyati asked me to write a meditator's guidebook, which I was very willing to do. I was actually in the process of, not so much they asked me to, rather both of us were kind of thinking about the value of this simultaneously and realized that we could support one another in making it happen. And I spent several years writing a meditator's guidebook to learning how to coming as a meditator and learning about the importance of some of these traditions and historical sites. I'm going through here fast. I don't know how to give a brief version to get to the point I want to go to. But to Pariyati's credit, I informed them from the start, I did not want this to be a Goenka meditator's guidebook. I wanted it to encompass the wider meditative traditions, even though I was very much within the Goenka tradition. By this point, I was developing a level of respect and interest in the other practices, even though I had no interest in doing them at the time. I really just, I was very committed and just wanted to acknowledge and respect their existence. To Pariyati's credit, they were fine with that. It was through my extensive research and visits and conversations with all different aspects of especially lineage sites, but other sites as well, that through the process of learning things that were started with the intention of giving me more faith and giving me more knowledge and background in this thing I was committing to. And it certainly did do that. Many things I learned did give me that faith. It also started to, I don't know if I'd want to say chip away at the faith, but to expose me to places where the narrative broke down and facts and things I was learning that just did not mesh with how it was being understood within the tradition. And I didn't know what to do with that. And I won't go into much more detail with that dichotomy because I've talked about it quite a bit on previous conversations. People can go back and listen to those parts if they haven't already. But that started to just to make me uncomfortable and to not know psychologically how to handle it. And there was no guide whatsoever for being able to talk to anyone about what I was going through and how to bring these two worlds together of my faith and my practice, and the origin of that faith and practice, which were in that place, were exposing me to problems with that faith and practice. I didn't know what to do with any of that. I think this inevitably would become a growing dichotomy and pain, really inner pain, that I didn't know who to talk to about it with, or even what words to give to it. And I think that one of the, I referenced this on the last podcast episode. I'll bring it up again just because it was such a pivotal moment in my understanding and relation. Is that on the first day of it? I believe it's the first day of the 20-day course. Goenka talks in the discourse. He makes fun of a technique in Burma where everyone is breathing hard and it sounds like a train engine, and it gets a laugh out of everyone. I'd heard that twice before on two previous 20-day courses. I didn't know who they were talking about. Learning they were talking about Sunlun Sayadaw, who's one of the most revered monks of the 20th century, friend of Webu Sayadaw, considered to be fully enlightened. It made me extremely uncomfortable and confused why Goenka would choose to mock a revered Burmese monk in the middle of a serious long course. It just didn't make sense to me why he would do that. And the reason why I referenced this incident as being important to me at the time, I didn't really go into detail about why it was so important. It was more of that it was just painful for me to hear this. The reason why it was so important was up to that moment, it was really a pivotal moment in my relation with the teacher, because up to that moment, I had really taken so much of what Goenka was saying unquestioned and really committed myself with faith to understanding and applying his words as far as I could, and always looking into myself to see if I was truly embracing the wisdom that this teacher was giving me to the greatest point possible. And that was really how I related to his words. When I heard that statement and I knew who he was talking about, I couldn't give that any wisdom or really any respect at all. And the only way I could relate to it was by asking a question I often ask as a trainer, as someone who works with linguistics and teachers. and really getting into discourse analysis and looking at sometimes when someone says something a certain way, backing up and saying, now, why did the psychology of this person or even myself choose to put words together in this way, in this manner? Let's see what we can learn about this person by applying this discourse analysis. And this is something I had done professionally. And at that moment, even on the course, I just started thinking, what kind of discourse analysis would I give of why Goenka at this time and place decided to do this? What drove him to want to say this? And that changed my relationship, really starting to look at it that way, changed my relationship of how I looked at everything afterwards. Because when I would start to see divergences, before I should say, when I saw divergences between what was being told and what was then being experienced by me in Burma, an experience I know that very few people in the world have. I was being in Myanmar is a very difficult thing to do at that time, and I was fortunate to have found a way to do so. So I had a very unique set of experiences to be able to make that contrast. And before, as I was doing so, I would just be confused, uncomfortable, not really know where to turn, how to understand it. But from this point on, I began to apply this kind of discourse analysis method where I would, rather than taking what Goenka said and thinking about it with a sense of reverence, with an introspection of, am I applying what he's saying the deepest way possible? Is there some blind spot where I'm not really being the pure student I want to be in this tradition? That I started to shift, and just whenever I'd hear him say anything, whether it was a discourse or an interview or a meditation instructions or a story, whatever else, I would ask myself, why is he choosing to say this at this time? What causes and conditions are leading him to want to frame it this way? So it was really taking a more critical, and by critical I don't mean negative, I mean openly critical and reflective of why is this being said in this way at this time, rather than just approaching it with pure reverence, and also with the mind of a teacher, or sorry, the mind of a student, where I'm really going to embrace this and follow this as far as I can go. And that was enormously painful. If there was any step that I've taken along the way that has similarly caused the kind of pain and discomfort as you just described, and really what was a moment for you, I didn't really have that. But this particular incident was something of that moment for me, because I was making a conscious decision by necessity. I didn't see how I can do otherwise. I mean, I was so confused and hurt by why Goenka would mock a monk like that in a context like that, and that built upon this discourse that had been building in my mind of other things that I didn't understand. And making that shift was really making, I didn't know it at the time, or maybe I did in some way. I think, I think actually I can remember my feeling at that time. I think I did know it even at that time, even though it wasn't like, I didn't know what other choice I had really though. So it wasn't like I was choosing to do it. It just felt like a necessity. But that moment was a way of looking at this person from a teacher to something else. And that was so painful. That was to make that mental shift in my mind that this was someone I was looking at with skepticism and reserve and even protection, that these words would not harm me, that they would not I would not be brainwashed by them, I'd not be conditioned by them, I would not be taught to think in the way that they were letting me to think, to look at it with this kind of self-protection and skepticism, after years and decades of so much reverence and dedication and benefit, as you've said before, extreme benefit that I and my mom and my best friend and my community of friends and everyone else has experienced. And to now look at this, it's almost like, I just realized this at the time, I don't think I've ever thought about this, it's almost like having a relationship with a troubled parent, and at some point realizing that the parenting they're providing is not adequate and is actually kind of dangerous or detrimental in some ways. And so stopping to look at that parent as an authority figure that you're giving some kind of authority over your actions and some kind of instruction, and looking at in terms of something you need protection from, not so much an abusive parent that is actively harming you, but something that I need to listen to this in a different way. I can't buy into this completely. I need to leave some part of my mind, or maybe a greater part of my mind, exploring how I'm hearing this and how I relate. And so if as I say, I've never been asked this before, and I don't know if I've thought about it quite in this way. I've thought about a lot of things, but not quite in this way. But as I'm reflecting on it now, I think there's a lot of points I can give for insights or pivotal moments or things that shifted in me. Nothing quite as clearly demarcated as you, but this particular moment just stands out so much at this time because it was a stark moment of the beginning of a mental shift. And I actually remember being somewhat heartbroken that whole 20-day course. I was not heartbroken because I had made a decision I wasn't going to sit more courses, and I did go back to centers and did sit and serve after that. It was not an end of the line for me. It was not, nothing was heartbroken in that sense because I hadn't come to those determinations, but it was heartbroken to me in the sense, and I was still diligently following the practice day after day. But it was like I had some level of doubt and mistrust and skepticism had gotten into me in a very concrete way and a very specific way of looking at it that had not come to me before. That was really something. And yeah, this is what I want to say. It was really like something I could never come back from. Like once I couldn't unsee or unhear or unthink what I felt like in that moment and what I saw in that moment. And the fact that I had then shifted over to that truth or that way of looking at things, I was not very pleased about, to be honest. It was not a relief. It was not a happy insight. It was a necessity that really deeply pained me. And going forward in all subsequent conversations where I would then re-enter the community and those people who still have that faith and reverence and practice and adherence and everything else, like I was looking at things differently, and my choices were either to stay silent or to fake and pretend a kind of that to be back in there, or to moderate myself to say things that were just truthful but really be careful and leaving that out. But then that became much more difficult because whenever I met any meditator in the tradition who knew the kind of background experience I had, all they wanted to do was talk. All they wanted to do was pick my mind and tell me their theories. And and then it was kind of put on the spotlight again of like, well, you're not really going to like what I have to say. And I don't really know how to say it, but that particular moment of how I related to that moment of the joke about Sunlun Sayadaw, it wasn't like that taught me things I hadn't known before. It was more like that coalesced things into something that had been building, and it just managed to build at that moment.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to this notion of there being an in and an out. And what you're describing is, even if you wanted to sort of stay in, you were going to stay in the same way, and people were going to know that, and you were going to know that, right? And I think that, yeah, I think that to keep coming in contact with this sense of an in and an out is in itself a painful, it's just a painful aspect of the tradition, I think. And yeah, I was in relationship with a lot of acharyas who felt like, as our dear friend Aisha would say, family. Friends and family. They were more. They were more. Yes, they were a part of sangha, but they were also a deep part of a sense of family and community, and played huge roles in the development of my life, in chapters of my life, in key stages, and in moments of crises for me. And what was lovely, I think, well, I guess what I want to say in terms of leaving, having watched so many people leave or come up against that in and out, and then have to make that choice, or to feel like, okay, they don't belong or whatever, and then hearing the response of members of the organization over the years, made it actually that much more difficult for me to leave, because I sensed that there really wasn't the possibility of leaving with dignity. And again, the structure of an in and an out, I think, kind of creates that. It's a failure to leave, or um, I don't have enough parami, or my karma is such that I'm not fit or can't make the grade, or some notion of that. And there's a sense of, I mean, I've actually witnessed um, senior ATs and old students you know um, having pity for folks who left because that somehow they, were not going to have a good salvation, or a good, their trajectory was uh, just not going to be the same elevated, numinous pathway that it would be had they stayed. And when you're aware of those kinds of messages, then the idea of leaving, and how, and the awareness of how that's going to be perceived or talked about. um, and I'm well aware, Joa, that you and I, just having this conversation, this series of conversations, will be labeled and dismissed by the conservative elements in the leadership as just simply negative, and not having, whatever, again, sufficient parami or karma, and not deserving of such a lofty tradition and path.
Or even being guided by Mara. I think some will claim that.
Oh yeah, that we are agents of Mara. Yeah, but these same acharyas are also some of the ones that I heard say things like, well, this is just the karma of people of color, and that's why this situation is the situation as it is in the tradition. This is just their karma. These were full acharyas who said things like that. So I'm aware that there are both conservative elements within the leadership, and then there's also more progressive, open-minded elements in the leadership, and also within the tradition. And again, it is really important for me to remember just how much benefit I have received from Goenkaji and from this tradition. And I'm not saying that just to kind of counter,
Mm-hmm.
all of this critical examination that we've been doing, but
Mm.
because I'm holding the two side by side. And when I really understand, that the organization is a group of humans, I really genuinely do have a lot of compassions for the tendencies that can happen, and the dysfunctions that can happen in the realm of groupthink and fundamentalism and rigidity. This happens in all organizations. I mean, even corporations, we know that, right? And it's just that when it happens in the context of an ideal such as personal liberation, the path of Dhamma, the Buddha's teachings, it's particularly poignant and painful to have to separate and know that you are now on the outside, and that that you may get labeled as an agent of Mara, the evil one. um, and it was painful. There was many months. I mean, actually, it was painful on a kind of a social level. I have to say, my practice at the time that I left, and Carolyn and I decided that, knowing that it's difficult to leave with dignity, and also that we might have to kind of front a lot of, just because of the way we were involved, front a lot of reactions to our departure. Um, we decided we would sort of do it in two steps, and one was just to step down as assistant teachers, and then it was a year later that we actually formally informed, our appointing acharyas and other folks that we had actually left the tradition and were pursuing other teachers and practices. And we did that on purpose, just so that we could actually step down with our own sense of dignity, and without having to front, a lot of reactions that we felt that were going to be coming from this place of either sort of, I don't know, you might compassionate pity, or what, I don't know, whatever their attitudes might be, or negativity around, us, not whatever, being agents of Mara or whatever. We just wanted to do that in a way that allowed us the space and the time to digest the decision and to live with the decision in a peaceful way. So we were somewhat discreet about our departure, but then we did inform everyone that we had left the tradition. And and for a while, we were kind of rudderless. We didn't have a teacher. What really helped me through that time was actually my own practice, because I was so I was actually so inspired by my practice at the time. I was so enthralled. I was just like I was just this new student, and my daily practice was just like, I don't know, I don't want to say it was like on fire. It was just like, oh my God, I was so every day I was riveted by my own practice. And that, that really got me through the transition. And it also confirmed that I had also, to some degree, felt like I had, you know, yeah, I guess for lack of better words, outgrown Goenkaji's tradition. That not that it doesn't have something to offer me, now I wouldn't ever say that, but just that, well, maybe I would, but I just that, that the whole framework was, yeah, I essentially felt like I had outgrown it in a way that I couldn't go back, and wouldn't want to go back at this point. That it would just feel like, um, yeah, it would feel like stepping back into, a very reduced, experience of the Dhamma. And I say that with all the respect because, again, I wouldn't be where I am now, without it. It's a funny thing to hold these two pieces, right? I just feel,
Yeah.
um, it's just this mix, right?
Hmm.
I do have this profound gratitude and this really, you know, um, clear, critical, piece to why the organization, may be actually failing to support many of its old students, not just me, not just you, and the many folks we know that have left, I just feel like there's so much more, you know, yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess the question is, how can you leave something that has given you so much benefit? And
Yeah.
it's really because, that I feel like the tradition could do better to live up to its own ideals. And I think, I really hope that our conversation, uh, moves for those, who are in the tradition, in Goenkaji's tradition still, whether you're in a representative way or you're just starting out, or even if you're, somewhat involved or, hoping to get more involved, that 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 this conversation, inspires people to, make the kind of organizational and cultural changes that I think uh, would allow for the tradition to be more open-minded, to be, less fundamentalist, to be less rigid, to be more inclusive, to be more inviting, to be, yeah, just open-minded. Really, I think is and open-hearted in many ways.
Yeah, and I mean, with that, I should mention that the intention of these conversations are in no way to tell people what to think or to change people's thinking or in any way to have them align with how you or I see it, which I'm sure is not identical either, or to have any agenda. The point of these conversations is to have critical thought. And if there is a way that people listen to this and they can engage honestly and openly with these conversations, and that this has them redouble and reaffirm their effort to continue practicing the Goenka tradition and perhaps to look at where changes need to be made according to however they see it. That's wonderful. I mean, that's great. It's really not trying to have an agenda and pushing people or insisting that things are this or that way. And on that note, if I think another concern or criticism that can come out is, well, maybe this was an unfair or uncritical conversation where we were just engaging in certain viewpoints. This is an open invitation for any representative or management or teacher in the Goenka organization, anywhere, from any center, from any position, to come on and have these conversations. And you will be treated fairly. You will be given your chance to talk and engage and explain your reasoning, and with any conditions even of what we might talk about or not talk about. Even the people that some of the teachers who might have referenced on this show to come and share and explain your side and your thinking, you will be given an honest and fair treatment of being able to discuss and engage. That's what this is all about. I don't know if that will happen because there are these issues with lack of transparency, secrecy, hierarchy, authority, everything else. And so usually this is all discussed deeply behind closed doors, but this is an open offer for that. I'm also just thinking as you talk about this, how to hold this deep genuine gratitude, that is something authentically felt and reflected upon, with the concerns for not just some of the shortcomings, but I think some of the real harm and some of the real danger that some of this conditioning, and the nature of the closed loop provides. And it's very hard. It's very difficult and delicate to know how to hold that. I mean, I don't know how many hours we've already spent here, and yet I feel that there are, dozens of different insights and anecdotes and thoughts that haven't been shared at all, or haven't been shared in the kind of depth or precision that I would like. And so, this is really an initial and opening foray into that. Just one anecdote that I might leave with, just because I talked about this with you, Jonathan, before we started recording. You encouraged me to share it, and haven't had a place yet, so I'll fit that in here. This is an anecdote that is looking at the both the benefit that one gets from practicing in the tradition, as well as kind of the care and concern have to have with the conditioning. So I was staying in 2012. I was staying at Shwayumin Monastery, which is presided by Sayadaw U Tejaniya. At this point, I was being very careful not to actually practice any of what he was teaching. And he doesn't really teach so much a technique. It's more a way of looking at things. So I was basically playing a game by continuing to practice the Goenka method in a monastery where the conversations and the dialogue and the teachings were coming from U Tejaniya. So I officially wasn't breaking the technique, but I was just in an environment where other kinds of conversations were happening. And on this particular day in 2012, this was the beginning of Myanmar's transition. And to make a big splash in terms of the how official this transition was really becoming, there was an unprecedented moment where President Obama said that he would come to Yangon for one day and deliver a talk at Rangoon University and meet Aung San Suu Kyi and some of the other leaders, as a very big moment in Myanmar's history, and really the date that is traced back to when the transition really began. And I was staying at Shwayumin with a tourist visa when I should have had a meditation visa. And usually this isn't so much of a problem, but the authorities were being so careful to prepare for a U.S. president's visit, which hadn't happened in I don't know how many decades, or maybe ever. That I was told that for 2 days I could not stay at Shwayumin, because I did not have the proper visa. If the authorities came and checked everything, they'd be in trouble. So I had to go to Yangon to stay for a couple days while Obama was in town. And I was not really prepared to do that. And as it happened, I'm not exaggerating. I think I literally got the last hotel room that was available in all of Yangon. There was, I don't know what people after me would have done, because seriously, every single hostel and bed everywhere was taken, just as a kind of a funny side note. But as I was leaving, I said to a fellow meditator, this is really sudden, and I'm not ready to go into the world. Like this meditation process is like a deep operation of the mind, and I feel exposed and vulnerable in this moment. I feel like my stuff is coming out. I'm just not ready to go into the world. I'm really I'm just really bothered by the fact that I can't stay here, and I have to figure out kind of how I'm going to manage this. And so basically, for those meditators who don't understand the underlying feature of that story, I'm bringing Goenka's language of this being a deep operation of the mind into a Sayadaw U Tejaniya Shwayumin environment, which doesn't really understand that analogy or really even follow it. And this meditator's immediate response was just laughing and dismissing it, just saying, "Oh, come on, this is not an operation of the mind. You're just observing. You're just being aware. You're observing things, up or down, this or that, whatever. Like don't be so dramatic about it." And I was like shocked, because I was like, for 20 years, this is a deep operation of the mind. Like, what's going on here? Like, that, how can this not? This is what I've been told. This is what I believe. But he dismissed it with so much confidence and so just naturally and obviously, that just in my moment and in my mind in that moment, I just was like, oh, it's not a deep operation of the mind. Oh, okay, like that makes sense. And I went into town and everything was fine. And that was just, and then I went and sat that 20-day course where I heard the comment about Sunlun Sayadaw, which so upset me. And the other contrast that happened at that time, which was kind of building on my own awareness and understanding and decision, is that with this kind of dismissal of this being a deep operation of the mind in this moment, I was aware that maybe meditation didn't have to take on these qualities in the way that Goenka described it. And as I started to look at this discourse analysis of, instead of having this reverence and this humility in how I practiced what he followed, to be a bit more critical and a bit more curious about, why are you using these words at this time? Like, what are you really trying to do? And as I went to this 20-day course, I was alarmed by the fact that everywhere I went, every detail of it was telling me how terribly painful and difficult and heavy and deep and serious this was going to be. From the application forms online to the application forms I had to sign in person, to the management, to the teachers, to Goenka's message, everything about this was just filling me with like a dread and a heaviness and a seriousness. And I just started to realize, like, this, I don't need to buy into this. It's very hard because the culture of the course in which I'm taking is telling me I need to buy into this. So it's very difficult for me to take the course and not buy into that part of the message. But it was also kind of liberating to know I had a choice, and that if I ran into difficulty, okay, I could acknowledge that difficulty. If I was scared or freaked out or anxious or depressed or, any other intense emotions, okay, I could deal with that. But it made me realize how much I was being conditioned on this particular point, that I should feel heavy. Words manifest things. They have power. And I was going into this with the conscious attitude of, I should be heavy and I should be serious. And, all the stuff I was bringing to Shui Min that day when I had to leave for Obama's visit, and realizing like, oh, I don't need this. I actually, this is, maybe this is true for some people, or it's true at some points, or maybe this is the vibe or the culture and the heaviness they want to bring to it. But I actually don't need to engage this way. I can, at that moment, at least, I can choose to engage in this authentically and legitimately, and just decide not to buy into this heaviness message, and kind of take the values I've gotten from other monasteries and teachings in Burma, that I can approach this with a light and casual and natural frame of mind. So, I share that story partly because you asked me to before we started. I'm trying to fit into this moment and trying to return back to the overall context of what we're talking about, just kind of as we wrap up, and looking at, how to hold the benefit and the gratitude that we have with some of the things that perhaps do need to be reformed, and that are not accurate or truthful, and that are even harmful, or requiring, as we've also talked about online, we didn't have a chance to really explore this in the podcast, but this idea that the nuance in expressing my experience with Goenka, and I think many people's, is that it is a closed loop system which acts with discouragement and suspicion of many things, whether they're narratives or facts or details or techniques or teachings. Anything outside of that closed loop is treated with punishment or suspicion or hesitation. And yet, within that closed loop, if you make that contract to not go outside of it in these ways, even mentally, even thinking about it, the benefit that you get from this closed loop is legitimately through the roof and miraculous, to borrow a word you used in your first couple podcasts. It is tremendously beneficial. And yet the contract to get access to belonging and being able to enter and access this enormous benefit that you legitimately get and that you're grateful for, is to resign oneself inside a closed system.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, Joa. I mean, I remember a dear friend of mine reflecting to me that the system is closed. And I was like, wait, what? I was like, what does that mean? Oh my God, it's a closed system. Oh my gosh, what does that mean? And as I pursued it, and this person, was studying to be a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, and looking at like closed, family systems, closed organizational systems, and it really opened my mind to, looking more objectively at the culture and the mindset of Goenka tradition. And closed systems are, systems that have firm boundaries between the organization and the outside environment, where they don't allow dynamics outside of the organization to impact the dynamics on the inside. And of course, it allows a lot for, they allowed for a lot more control of the messaging and of in this case, I think, the developmental path that people take in the Buddhist teachings. And I think that's kind of where we have to ask ourselves: is the Dhamma a closed or an open system? Did the Buddha intend for an open or a closed system? Are all traditions closed for the most part? Which ones are open? You could argue, like corporations like Google and the Android systems are open because they're very porous in terms of the way they allow for apps to be created and all that. And Apple has tried to be more closed. Um, Slavery is definitely considered to be the most closed human system that exists, right? So that's on one extreme. Um, and I think Goenkaji's organization allows people to come and go without coercion. But staying requires a sacrifice that you've discussed around the exclusivity, no meaningful peer dialogue, no outside discourse. It's very non-porous, just and you have to kind of be okay with that to be on the inside. Is this antithetical to the Buddhist teachings? Closed systems tend to be autocratic. They tend to be regressed, or certainly to tend toward that way. And they tend to be less transparent, more secretive, more isolated. They tend to, psychologically. I have a dear friend, my friend Tom Yeoman, who is a PhD and looks at group dynamics, particularly within a spiritual context, and has kind of created this matrix around what does it mean, the ultimate closed system, of course, is a cult. And I don't think Goenkaji's tradition is a cult as much as other folks have suggested it might be. I because it's not, doesn't have that level of overt coercion, manipulation, and harm. And I think it's important to talk about that. Like that is one extreme. But I do believe that Goenkaji's tradition is on the more regressive side of closed systems. That the sort of control of an exchange of information and is centralized. It's one way. These are on this spectrum. These are places that these are ingredients that define a more closed system. A suppression of difference. We've touched on that a lot. This kind of conservation of these tenets that define, uh, the in this case the branding, you might say, Goenkaji's branding, and yeah, and then it involves then this kind of in and out subgroups, right? But it also it creates a kind of a false group identity. People don't they're not going to feel, as I didn't certainly, that you can show up with your whole self, and that there's a tendency for more fear-based behavior, again around whether you're going to be included or not included. And on the more open side, I think open systems really they you're more of a contributing member. There's more of an exchange. There's more of an equal exchange. There's feedback is allowed. There's more equity and in the sort of influence relationships. The you might say the power relationships. There's people feel like they can show up with their full selves and be full contributors. There's more place for humor, and creativity, and just yeah. So I think that looking at those critical pieces around what is an open system and what's a closed system, and trying to understand, is I mean, certainly you definitely got this. You get the sense reading the Pali Canon that even the Buddha's sangha was a hierarchical. There were chief disciples, there were chief lay disciples, chief monastic disciples, chief monks, chief nuns, and so and they had different roles, right? And there was also the foremost in qualities. But I think the difference is that those positions were in fact defined by qualities, and particularly qualities of attainment, qualities of liberation, rather than arbitrarily or self-defined positions of appointment that are subjective and yeah, I think subjective and somewhat random and not necessarily consistent in standards that you see in the Goenka tradition. And that positionality is, I think, one of the pieces there that ends up also sort of coupled with it being a closed system, you then hang on to these positions, whether it's you're a center manager or whether you're a committee member or you're, there's just there or even in the hall, right? Even meditating in the hall, Goenkaji had positionality. I don't know if you remember the hot seat, right? The seat in front of the
Mhm.
AT, right? But that and then I mean, I understand wanting to put returning students in front of old students to be an example. But a lot of retreat centers don't do that. You just sit willy nilly, in the hall, and so
Mm.
that sense of positioning begins actually very early on in the Goenka system. And again, it's you get conditioned in these sort of closed system traits that um, make it challenging to then feel like you have a voice, to feel like you can question things. And these are natural human needs to do. And so I am wanting to hold this deep reverence and deep appreciation and deep gratitude and deep sense of benefit that I have received from Goenkaji and from the tradition, with a need to be, I need to speak out and to be, critical, and to hope that the organization will become a more open system and openly invite civil discourse and dialogue and conversation and questioning, and not think that that's going to be a threat to the path of Dhamma, So yeah, I'm with you there, Joa.
Mm, yeah, thanks for that. So just to close, I think maybe turn the last question a bit more personal about what this experience has been like for you and the number of hours that we've just spoken so vulnerably and I'm going to say publicly, although that's with podcasts, it's kind of a funny thing. I mean, this is there are two people right now who have ever heard this, and yet when it goes out it's going to number into hundreds and thousands. But so the process of talking is not quite public yet, but it's with the intention of knowing it's going to be public, and then there's going to be that response to it, which as we've talked about, is definitely as people engage in the content and the and are critical of what we say in terms of their opinions and the content. It's very welcome. It's lovely to have those conversations, but there also will be some nasty things said personally, which won't be fun, but goes with the territory. But you haven't the reason we've told your story, and we've never done this with any other guest, is just how much your particular story has intersected, of starting with the tradition and then becoming more serious and becoming a teacher and learning a bit about what goes on with being a teacher and those responsibilities and the Dhamma brothers and the racial things you dealt with and the and then leaving, and then Burma's in the middle of that. And so you kind of hit a lot of marks in your story that are hidden upon themes and things that are greater than yourself, that we're able to bring and talk about. And from your side, this is something we've talked about for years and took a certain comfort level to get to this point, and now you've done it. It's not public yet, and that will be the next thing to see how it feels when it released and what the response is. But you have done the conversation, and the conversation is recorded. So to get metta, and that's META, not METTA, but to get metta, what and check in with you and your thoughts about this process. How do you feel at the end of this, at having exposed yourself and your thinking, and exposed yourself publicly in ways that take courage to be able to do, knowing the different responses that will come, having been at the end of this process, and after thinking about whether or not you wanted to participate in this for years, how do you feel at this point for what we've discussed and where we've came, and just your general feelings and emotions with this corpus that we'll now be leaving listeners with?
Well, first of all, Joa, I just want to appreciate you because, first of all, you've extended an invitation to come and speak with you like this for, I think, a few years now, and partly because I didn't feel ready, partly because I also felt afraid of speaking whatever in a way that would be perceived as against the inside of the organization, and the fallout from that, the fallout of potentially losing friends and people who I actually really care a lot about, even folks who I disagreed intensely with, people who I feel like family members with. I hope they can see this in the light of of the deep appreciation that I do have, um, for the tradition, and like I said, just the need to want, that in the way that we just had this conversation, the way that we just explored our different experiences, that will invite an organizational response to do a similar thing, to open those avenues up within the organization. That's my hope. But yeah, coming into this, I was nervous. I was wondering, can I really hold these two pieces? Certainly, as I mentioned, at different moments, I was extremely disillusioned. I became extremely disillusioned and extremely sad, and at times angry at the organization. I didn't want to lead from that place of negativity. I wanted to really, uh, really have a sense that, yes, okay, this, yes, I've gotten, there has been harm. I do feel like there is harm. It's not at the extreme level of harm of some, really extreme closed group situations, but there, just the harm of being, of what groupthink can do, what fundamentalism can, how it can manifest. And you are harmed when you begin to fearfully question, to question that with, trepidation and fear of not being accepted, or not being included because of that questioning. um, and so I'm really, I'm actually, it's funny, I wasn't sure if this was going to be our last session, Joe. I'm just like, is this really, are we at the end here? And maybe there will be more things we want to add, but
Sure.
I do feel actually really quite kind of complete, as we close this session, whether it's a kappa or not. I do
Mm.
feel very complete inside. I feel like I was able to share both sides, right? Both, and that they don't contradict each other. They, my deep, deep and profound, appreciation for the tradition and for Goenkaji and for the practice, um, goes hand in hand with, how I'm growing in Dhamma now, and and yeah, I think, and that's because I was willing to ask questions and to be critical and allow myself to do kind of what at one point seemed to be unthinkable, which is to question everything that you and I have both, been questioning in our respective paths here. So I really appreciate. I just want to appreciate again the welcoming that you've provided here to have a conversation, because your contributions have also helped me articulate and clarify mine. And I don't I wouldn't want to say that it's totally complete. I think there's a lot of other rabbit holes we can certainly go
Oh
down.
yeah.
But I think we covered a lot of the pieces that, we had spoken about before over the years, and I'm really pleased with that. And I'm pleased with the tone, the respectful tone that I think that we, that we have for it, that we have carried through the conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think that this is, I think that this conversation is complete in the sense that it told your trajectory and your narrative arc, from start to finish in with each segment, and with each segment there was an opportunity for examining some element of your life at that time, whether it was the racial injustice or the experiences in Burma, or becoming a serious meditator, finding the tradition in the first place, and then starting to have questions and doubts, and it was able to follow these parts and flesh them out in each detail. Of course, the rabbit holes are endless, and it's not complete in the sense that that we have covered all topics that we've covered, that the topics we've covered have been in any way adequate. I mean, this is this conversation itself is on the backs of years made up of hours and hours of conversations, writings, emails, Zoom conversations, voice messages, and many others between me and you and another handful of people, some of whom are senior teachers still in the tradition who won't be named because they confidentiality in those conversations was a part of the condition of having them. I think that's another aspect of the fear in even engaging in talking about this. But there are many more things to explore, and I think I'm excited to release this. And and to be able to gauge the reaction and the feeling and see where that goes. And you and I might continue. I think you and I definitely will continue at some point to pick this back up and address it and go into different elements that we want to talk about in detail. But there also could be an opportunity for other people to come on and pick this up in their own way, whatever way that is. And as to reiterate the invitation I gave a few minutes ago, I would be absolutely delighted if a teacher or a serious practitioner were to come and to honestly engage in a critical, respectful discussion about any of these points. And I think that this only benefits us more as long as we're operating in good faith, as long as we're open to examining bias and assumption and our own personal ways of our blind spots and where we look at and everything around that. I think that that there are a lot of possible paths forward. This is not meant to be something that's comprehensive or conclusive, but something, as long as it is, something that is really just taking very, very initial baby steps at just merely introducing some of these ideas for the first time in this kind of consumption.
Yeah, I really hope it does spur more conversations from others in the organization with you and with each other. And I wish you a lot of strength in editing our sessions down. I'm sure that's not going to be a pretty job, but I look forward, to listening, I think, to the end product. And again, Joa, thank you so much for creating this space and for being persistent in inviting me. It really reminds me of our old times in Myanmar, and just really appreciate the reconnection at this level. So thank you again. Yeah.
We'd like to take this time to thank our generous supporters who have already given. We simply could not continue to provide you with this content and information without the wonderful support of generous donors, listeners, and friends like you. Each episode helps in providing access to one more voice, one more perspective, one more insight. Every donation of any size is greatly appreciated and helps us continue this mission. We greatly appreciate your generosity, which allows us to maintain this platform. Thank you. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam